Medieval humanity nearly engineered its own extinction. Doctors drained the blood of the sick until they fainted. Cities dumped waste into the same rivers. And during a rat-borne plague, communities systematically killed every cat in sight. The plague didn't need to fight humans. Humans were doing the work themselves. These weren't the actions of a stupid society. This was a civilization capable of building soaring cathedrals and surviving brutal winters. Their failure was an unwavering loyalty to tradition. They prioritized the wisdom of the past over the physical evidence of the present. This diagram illustrates the medical theory that governed their world, the four humors. It assumed the body was a balance of fluids, and that every illness was simply an overflow. In this logic, the symptoms don't matter. Whether a patient has a fever or a cough, the system funnels the solution to a single output: remove the blood. When a patient's health collapsed, doctors rarely questioned the treatment. Instead, they concluded that the balance hadn't been restored yet. They doubled down, removing more blood from a body that was already failing. In this loop, the more the patient suffered, the more the traditional cure was applied. Our own inability to see ourselves clearly has proven more dangerous than any hostility in nature. To survive, we had to build systems, tools, and stories that forced us to confront the brutal truth. The Norse cosmos is held together by an enormous ash tree called Yggdrasil, an organic, fragile structure under constant attack. Serpents gnaw at its roots, while decay strips its bark. To the Vikings, the universe was not a safe sanctuary. It was a system that was slowly, inevitably dying. Even their gods occupied a position of vulnerability. Odin sacrificed his own eye and hung himself from the world tree for 9 days, pierced by a spear, just to gain a deeper understanding of reality. This established a cultural law. Clarity is never a gift. It is something bought with pain. You can see the result of that clarity carved into this stone. The Vikings believed in Ragnarok, a fixed final collapse where the sun would be devoured and the gods would lose. It was an expiration date for existence, and they carried it with them as a matter of fact. This belief removed the paralysis of fear. Since the end was already written and the gods themselves would fall, the Vikings focused entirely on the one thing they could control, the resolve they showed while facing it. Norse mythology functioned as a framework for reality testing. By accepting the certainty of destruction, they replaced the false hope of safety with a culture of immense psychological resilience. For thousands of years, the human face was something you were, but never something you stared at. Identity was built outward, defined by your lineage and your labor. Without a way to see yourself, the self remained unobservable and unjudgeable. The first intentional mirrors, made of polished obsidian, changed the human mind. Looking into this dark, heavy stone created a split between the person acting and the person watching. For the first time, you could stand outside your own body and inspect it. Glass mirrors removed the dark distortion of stone, offering a precise and unyielding view of every flaw and every sign of age. The face stopped being a symbolic presence and became a visible object, one that could be studied, compared, and corrected. Daily access to these reflections internalized the act of being watched. People began to monitor their expressions and practice their movements, adjusting their behavior to match the image they saw. The mirror taught us to rehearse our identities before presenting them to the world. This constant self-monitoring turned appearance into social evidence. By forcing individuals to govern their own behavior through an imagined outside perspective, the mirror helped produce the predictable conduct needed for complex, crowded societies to function. Once we could observe our bodies, we needed a way to observe our inner lives. In the late Renaissance, a group of Italian thinkers set out to create a mechanism that could capture and display the raw, often hidden reality of human emotion. This was a reaction against the music of the time. Renaissance polyphony was intellectually brilliant, but the meaning of the words was buried. The music was a decoration that obscured the emotional truth of the story. Look at this diagram. It's a tangled web of overlapping voices. The composers of the first operas cleared that web away. moving to a single, bold line of music that followed the natural cadence of a human voice. They wanted a new music that didn't just accompany a character's grief or rage, but actually embodied it. This new form used dissonance and rhythm to mimic the way a voice cracks or a heart races. It allowed music to stretch a single moment of indecision or regret across minutes, forcing the audience to sit inside that emotion and observe its every detail. Opera proved that art could act as an emotional mirror. By isolating and magnifying specific feelings, it allowed audiences to study human sorrow and desire with surgical precision, turning private experience into a shared truth. Humanity survived the Middle Ages by stubbornly building tools that forced us to abandon our comfortable illusions. We framed the brutality of nature through myth. We corrected our behavior by looking in the mirror, and we processed our internal chaos through the emotional realism of opera. These systems created a permanent psychological tension. We now live as both the actor experiencing the world and the audience relentlessly judging our own performance. This constant uncomfortable friction of being watched by our own creations is what prevents us from retreating into the blind certainty of the past. It is the mechanism that drives us to improve. Our ultimate human superpower is the ability to build these mirrors. We survive by forcing ourselves to look at exactly who we are, flaws and all, so we can finally learn how to be better. When our modern environment gets too hot or a system feels too rigid, our instinct is to blast the air conditioning, build thicker walls, and brute force our way to comfort. We fight the constraints around us. Look back at the ancient Middle East or the Byzantine Empire, and you find people surviving Earth's most unforgiving physical climates and political structures long before the invention of HVAC systems or modern legal rights. These societies survived by doing the exact opposite of applying brute force. They learned the deep rhythms of the constraints around them and weaponized them. Historical mastery rarely looks like overpowering the board. It looks like learning the rules so intimately that you end up redefining how the entire game is played. Look at this expanse of the Arabian desert. The environment here is so lethal, the ambient temperature can melt the soles of your sandals while you are walking. To survive it, the Bedouins developed a highly specific clothing strategy for the harsh climate. Notice these loose, billowing, dark robes. Instead of shedding layers to beat the heat, they wear light-colored cotton under dark goat hair. This structure traps a layer of air against the skin, creating a personal evaporative breeze while entirely blocking direct sunlight. Their housing follows the exact same logic. These tents are woven from goat hair. When the desert is dry, the weave stays open to let airflow through. During rare, sudden rains, those same natural fibers swell up and close the gaps, making the shelter completely waterproof. Then there is their hydration strategy. Sitting in 115-degree heat, a Bedouin will pour and drink a glass of boiling hot tea. This diagram shows the biological physics at work. Drinking hot liquid signals your body's internal sensors to rapidly increase sweat production. In the bone-dry desert air, that sweat evaporates instantly, pulling heat away from the skin and lowering your core temperature far more efficiently than chugging cold water. By aligning their architecture and their own biology with the thermodynamic rules of the desert, the Bedouins turned an inhospitable furnace into a manageable home. Further east, in Persia, the objective shifted from simply surviving the arid landscape to mastering it by pulling water directly into the dry plains. To see how they achieved this, look at this cross-section of the Persian terrain. Engineers dug a network of underground tunnels called a qanat. By gently sloping from mountain aquifers, this system kept water completely shielded from the sun, preventing evaporation. Once surfaced, it splits into a perfectly symmetrical 4-quadrant grid. This chaharbagh imposes rigid geometry onto the chaotic desert. Looking down the center of one of these grids, you can see how the design manipulates the senses. The reflecting pools catch the sky, the tight rows of cypress trees provide heavy shade, and the flowing water creates constant sound, turning a dry plot of dirt into a sensory sanctuary. These gardens relied entirely on the harsh contrast of the desert surrounding them to make their engineered shade and water feel miraculous. The rules of survival extended well beyond physical landscapes into social ones. In the Byzantine Empire, marriage was a cold, calculated transaction. Fathers negotiated these unions to merge estates, secure trade routes, or by political influence. The bride herself usually had zero voice in selecting her partner or shaping her immediate fate. But the contract that sealed the marriage contained a critical mechanism. The dowry a woman brought into the union remained legally hers. If the husband died or the political alliance fractured, she had an enforceable claim to those exact assets. With their dowries locked in, clever brides used that wealth to oversee sprawling estates, build networks of influence, and shape their family's future. Operating strictly within the confines of a rigid patriarchal system, Byzantine women turned transactional alliances into their own specific seats of political leverage. A few centuries later, the Ottoman court at Topkapi Palace refined the control of women into an institutional science. The imperial harem was specifically structured to keep concubines isolated, disposable, and entirely separated from real political authority. A Christian slave named Alexandra entered that system. Renamed Hurrem, she recognized the traditional protocol: bear the sultan a single son, then accept permanent exile to a provincial palace. She simply refused to follow it. By bearing multiple children and cultivating powerful allies like the Grand Vizier, she positioned herself as the central node of court strategy, systematically isolating her political rivals from the sultan's ear. She then convinced Sultan Suleiman to legally marry her. This shattered centuries of Ottoman precedent, transforming her from a piece of imperial property into a sovereign partner. Hurrem Sultan recognized that she could never overthrow the Ottoman Empire from the outside. She mastered the internal mechanisms of the harem to architect an entire era where women drove state policy. Whether facing the scorching sands of Arabia, the dry plains of Persia, the rigid courts of Byzantium, or an imperial harem's velvet shadows, the constraints were absolute. Survival and lasting power in these harsh environments never came from applying brute force or wishing the rules were different. True mastery requires the humility to accept the exact dimensions of an unforgiving landscape, and the strategic patience to use those very dimensions to build your own paradise. In ancient Rome, an emperor could rule half the known world and still face a fine for wearing the wrong shade of purple, crying too loudly at a funeral, or walking around at night looking suspiciously alive. To the Romans, public emotion was a fire hazard. They regulated grief and status because, in a city of over 1 million people, they believed uncontrolled feelings spread faster than logic, and a crowd that gathered to mourn could instantly transform into a violent crowd that gathered to riot. This claustrophobic city center had no ID cards or helpful uniforms. Order relied entirely on visual clarity. If a senator's toga didn't immediately signal his rank, or if a bathroom sanitation wasn't strictly regulated, the machine broke down into filth, disease, and political chaos. Rome viewed these micromanagements as preventative maintenance. From their perspective, the only way to ensure the survival of the empire was to aggressively suppress the unpredictable nature of the individual. In the 1790s, the newly formed United States found itself in a similar Roman dilemma. The federal government was a fragile experiment, and its leaders believed that if their authority wasn't visible and absolute, the republic would fracture before it began. Alexander Hamilton used the whiskey tax to force this issue. It wasn't just a revenue measure. It was a mechanism designed to prove the federal government could reach across mountain ranges and compel obedience from its most distant citizens. This chart reveals the disparity in how that authority was felt. While large eastern distilleries paid a low, predictable flat fee, small frontier farmers were squeezed by a per-gallon cost that was mathematically designed to favor industrial production over local survival. On the frontier, distance was a physical weight. Hauling raw grain over these muddy forest trails was often impossible, leaving farmers with only one compact, durable way to move their value to market: whiskey. Whiskey functioned as liquid currency and a symbol of self-reliance. By taxing it, the government wasn't just collecting money, it was inserting itself into the basic rhythms of frontier survival. When a state mandates a single, rigid order to ensure its own stability, it creates a pressure cooker for the people forced to live under it. That pressure makes future friction inevitable. By 1794, the frontier's resistance moved beyond petitions. Farmers began raising liberty poles and organizing into committees, framing their refusal to pay the tax as a defense of the very revolution the government claimed to represent. Protests turned into violent physical assaults. Armed mobs attacked tax inspectors, burned the homes of federal officials, and publicly tarred and feathered anyone attempting to enforce the law. George Washington responded by personally leading a militia of nearly 13,000 men west. It was a force so massive it stunned the rebels into submission without a major battle, demonstrating that the federal government had the capacity to act with overwhelming resolve. The government successfully compelled obedience, but it didn't solve the underlying grievance. Force can secure a territory, but it cannot manufacture the genuine consent required to actually lead it. This same friction between rigid structure and individual truth doesn't just play out in politics. It exists inside the mind of anyone whose internal intensity refuses to fit the external rules of their time, as it did for Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh spent years attempting to submit to traditional societal structures, trying his hand as an art dealer, a teacher, and a missionary. Each time, his inability to moderate his emotions led to his rejection. Eventually, he stopped trying to blend in. He began attacking the surface of the canvas directly, replacing traditional polish with thick, vibrating brushstrokes that favored emotional truth over realistic accuracy. This artistic breakthrough came at a punishing physical and mental cost. Van Gogh's life became a constant negotiation between his psychological illness and a discipline so obsessive that it eventually left him exhausted and alone. While the weight of that existence eventually crushed him, his refusal to comply with traditional rules created a visual language that articulated the silent, internal storms common to anyone on the edge of society. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans became a place where the collision of rules and reality was audible. It was a dense, volatile melting pot, where European musical notation and conservatory-trained discipline collided daily with the communal rhythms and oral traditions of African and Caribbean communities. Jazz emerged from this friction. It wasn't a rejection of structure, but a fusion of it, taking the rigid mathematical beats of marching bands and injecting them with the loose, improvisational survival expressions of a marginalized population. You can hear the compromise in this spontaneous street parade. These musicians are using formal brass instruments and traditional uniforms to conduct a ritual that is entirely loose, emotionally driven, and created in the moment. This was the sound of humans negotiating order and freedom in real time. It allowed for the individual's voice to be heard without requiring the collective structure to collapse. As jazz expanded northward, it formalized into massive, highly orchestrated ensembles. It moved from the street into the ballroom, adopting strict dress codes and sophisticated arrangements that turned the music into a mainstream art form. But whenever order becomes too predictable, a new friction arrives. In the 1940s, bebop musicians began intentionally shattering these tempos, reclaiming the music's confrontational edge to ensure the individual voice wasn't lost in the arrangement. Breaking those musical rules required an intense concentration and a flawless understanding of the structures they were pushing against. Innovation wasn't an act of chaos, it was an act of extreme discipline. This is the recurring pattern of civilization. Like the whiskey rebels, jazz pushes back against overreach. Like Van Gogh, it channels raw inner truth against a rigid world. We are not forced to choose between Roman tyranny and total chaos. True freedom is the practice of carving out an improvised space between the rules, finding a way to stay human within the machine.
We're taught that historical power was built on battlefields and sealed with iron crowns. But crowns are just metal, and armies can only hold a border. To actually survive on the throne, rulers had to look much closer to home. A title on a parchment couldn't stop an assassin or a rival faction. Real survival required infiltrating the minds, instincts, and loyalties of people in the very next room. Across 3 distinct eras, the most effective rulers didn't just command subjects. They systematically stripped autonomy from the living beings orbiting them, repurposing them into instruments of the state. The true architecture of an empire relied on the transformation of servants, lovers, and even animals into living weapons. If you found yourself working on the Palatine Hill in the 1st century, you weren't considered a person. You were property. In Rome, the worst thing that could happen was being noticed by the people who collected humans the way others collected marble busts. The Emperor Caligula claimed to be a living god, and he used that divinity to engineer an environment of absolute hypervigilance. Survival in his court required treating every interaction like an unscripted play. You learned to walk without sound and read the exact tilt of the emperor's head. A single dropped cup or a moment of hesitation was treated as treason. Caligula routinely assigned impromptu roles to his senators and servants, turning dinners into public endurance tests. If he demanded you describe his brilliance or ordered you to laugh at a terrible joke, you performed perfectly. Failing to applaud a living god had a very short career path. This sprawling complex functioned as a cage of choreographed anxiety, designed to protect the court from the emperor rather than the world from the palace. Centuries later, in Renaissance Florence, the Medici family discovered a much cleaner method of control. They realized that seduction and interpersonal leverage were far more efficient than deploying an army. The Medici weaponized beauty, deploying these women as invisible diplomats to gather state secrets and soften the egos of the family's rivals. Even the Vatican was pulled into this sensual diplomacy. Illegitimate sons, usually a source of shame for noble houses, were intentionally groomed for the clergy. By elevating their own flesh and blood into papal robes, the Medici merged earthly desire with sacred authority. When moralists attacked their extravagance, the family countered by funding hospitals and commissioning breathtaking religious art. They managed public scandals like chess moves, using whispered rumors to distract their enemies while cementing lucrative alliances. They didn't need to threaten their subjects with a sword. The Medici held absolute power because they engineered a society where their subordinates actively desired to be used for political gain. In the medieval era, authority required a different kind of proof. For the nobility, absolute dominance was demonstrated by bending the natural world to their exact will. Even companion animals were bred as social statements. Lapdogs and elegant greyhounds were kept as extensions of a noble's grace and emotional fidelity, turning affection itself into a heavily curated performance. To command the sky was a massive display of influence. A falcon perched on a ruler's wrist was wildness tamed by aristocratic discipline, a ritualized performance showing the universe yielding to the ruler's command. The ultimate living weapon was the destrier. This armored engine of war was bred to carry hundreds of pounds of steel into chaos without flinching. For commanders like Edward the Black Prince, the warhorse was an extension of his own fury. Through years of relentless training, they forged an intense bond, reading subtle shifts in weight and breath to move as a single, devastating force on the battlefield. The animal carried the knight's honor and life, and secured his legacy in death. Effigies often depicted these creatures resting beneath their masters, a permanent symbol that the noble's command outlasted a mortal lifespan. By commanding these powerful beasts, the medieval elite provided visceral proof that their authority extended over the entire natural order. The Roman servant, the Florentine courtesan, and the medieval warhorse were the true, living architecture of historical power. This extreme control reveals the throne's vulnerability. Absolute power is a fragile, unnatural state, always at risk of collapsing. To prevent this,
rulers couldn't just issue decrees. They had to make continuous micro-adjustments to the people and creatures immediately around them, enforcing their will daily. Without engineered anxiety in the palace, the weaponized affections of the court, and disciplined loyalty in the stable, history's greatest empires would have been nothing but empty rooms.
We usually imagine history as a grand timeline of kings, crowns, and sweeping battles. But for billions of ordinary people, life was a daily, unrelenting, and grinding fight against mud and starvation. Step outside your designated social class or lose your economic footing, and the consequences were immediate. Without a single safety net in place, a string of bad luck ended in freezing to death on a roadside or facing the executioner. To stay alive and secure your place, you had to master 3 everyday systems: the buildings you slept in, the clothes on your back, and the markets where you traded. These architecture, clothing, and commerce systems functioned as the silent, rigid rulebooks required to navigate an unforgiving social hierarchy. For a medieval peasant, leaving the village was a massive physical risk. You traveled barefoot, with no coin, no noble backing, and absolutely no guarantee of a bed. So you looked for barns. Animals like oxen and cows were massive, breathing radiators. Curling up next to a 2,000-pound beast offered a crucial source of body heat to stave off hypothermia during the night. If a barn was full, you sought out abandoned cottages or burnt-out mills. People genuinely believed these ruins were haunted by ghosts or cursed by the plague, but a collapsed roof still offered a free shield against the freezing wind. Then there were the churchyards. Sleeping among the graves put you on holy ground, which served as a useful deterrent against bandits who feared divine retribution. Looking at the exposed stone of abbey ruins like these, you can see the reality of monastic hospitality. Seeking sanctuary meant brutal floors and watery soup. Even inside these complexes, you were usually directed to a drafty stone porch, fully exposed to the night air. For the vast majority of humanity, architecture offered zero comfort or aesthetic beauty. A building was simply a physical barrier to keep you from freezing to death before dawn. Contrast that with the elite of Tudor England. At the top of the social ladder, physical warmth was guaranteed. Survival here meant maintaining your political existence, and your weapon of choice was your wardrobe. The monarchy enforced strict sumptuary laws to control exactly who could wear what. This diagram shows how luxury materials like purple dye, gold embroidery, and sable fur were legally restricted to the nobility, ensuring that wealthy merchants couldn't fake their way into the upper class. King Henry VIII used these restricted materials to project total dominance. In this portrait, his fur-lined crimson robe and aggressively large padded pouch broadcast his wealth. Look closely at his sleeves. Nobles destroyed an expensive outer layer to reveal a second luxury silk underneath. Women navigated this dangerous environment with equal calculation. Here, Anne Boleyn's stark black dress and heavy pearl jewelry project wealth, while symbolizing religious purity. None of this was comfortable. Nobles wore massive, stiffly starched linen ruffs around their necks that heavily restricted their movement. This discomfort was the point. It proved the wearer paid other people to do their manual labor. Tudor fashion functioned as a wearable prison. It was a highly regulated performance where one wrong fabric choice could result in steep fines, in public shaming, or total political ruin. Meanwhile, in the medieval Arab world, survival and status played out in a completely different arena, the bazaar. These sprawling markets were sensory explosions, serving as the absolute social and economic heartbeat of cities like Cairo and Baghdad. The bazaar funneled resources from across the hemisphere into a single neighborhood. This image shows the massive volume of trade, including saffron worth its weight in silver, that turned these cities into primary medieval financial centers. Because of this wealth, rulers monitored the markets heavily. State-appointed inspectors patrolled the stalls to enforce taxes, confiscate rigged weights, and listen closely for any whispers of rebellion. Looking at this illustration of a bustling market, we see a rare equalizing effect. Strict outside rules relaxed, allowing nobles, scholars, and commoners to haggle face to face. The narrow stalls forced different social classes into close proximity, exchanging ideas just as often as goods. In these winding streets, commerce became a vital tool for human connection. The bazaar stood as a rare pre-modern space where trade actually allowed people to bypass rigid social barriers. The shivering peasant seeking a warm barn, the Tudor noble suffocating in a stiff ruff, and the merchant haggling over imported saffron seem worlds apart. But they were all playing the exact same high-stakes game. The ways these people found shelter, displayed their bodies, and traded across borders established recurring patterns of social signaling that still define how human communities organize. We no longer face the threat of freezing to death on a pilgrimage, or the executioner's block for wearing the wrong velvet, but that underlying drive to signal our identity, protect our standing, and carve out our place in the hierarchy survives intact today.
Traditional power follows a predictable cycle. It is designed to be inherited through bloodlines, held by men, and protected by a rigid adherence to centuries of established custom. But that system had no room for Elizabeth Tudor. By age 2, her mother had been executed, and her title stripped by a stroke of a quill. She spent her 20s as a political prisoner in the Tower of London, waiting behind the lattice of the Traitor's Gate for the executioner's block. In Japan, Oda Nobunaga faced the same dismissal. His peers saw a minor lord who dressed eccentrically and socialized with peasants. They labeled him the Fool of Owari, assuming he lacked the discipline to survive the civil wars of the 16th century. Then there was Lady Yodo, an orphaned hostage of those same wars, and Ogade Khan, a nomadic warlord inheriting a massive settled empire that bore no resemblance to the mobile steppe he was born to lead. These 4 figures were outsiders, excluded from the established pathways to authority. To survive, they couldn't simply play by the rules, they had to rewrite them. When Elizabeth took the throne, the expectation was that she would immediately select a husband to manage the realm on her behalf. She resisted. By cultivating the identity of the Virgin Queen, she transformed her single status into a strategic asset, keeping European rivals in a state of constant paralyzing guesswork while she maintained her independence. This control extended to her public image. She didn't dress for fashion, she dressed for authority. The massive ruffs, lead white makeup, and jewel-heavy gowns were calculated to declare her the living, invincible embodiment of the English state. Oda Nobunaga utilized his own reputation as a tool for misdirection. He leaned into the image of the fool to encourage his enemies' arrogance, ensuring they never viewed him as a credible threat until it was too late. That arrogance cost his rival everything. In 1560, a warlord with 25,000 men stopped his army in a muddy gorge to celebrate. During a sudden thunderstorm, Nobunaga's small, disciplined force struck the unarmored camp, killing the commander and instantly shifting the balance of power in Japan. When you lack traditional numbers or legitimacy, weaponizing your own image becomes the most effective way to topple established giants. Nobunaga went on to dismantle the very core of the samurai class. He bypassed years of traditional sword training by arming commoners with imported matchlocks. These firearms allowed a disciplined foot soldier to kill an elite mounted noble from a distance, ending the era of the individual hero. He then targeted the political power of the priesthood. In 1571, his troops destroyed the temples of Mount Hiei and slaughtered thousands, demonstrating that no spiritual authority would be allowed to rival his secular rule. Following the death of her husband, Lady Yodo was expected to follow the social script of feudal Japan, to shave her head, enter a temple, and disappear from the political record. She chose the opposite. From within Osaka Castle, she managed the Toyotomi treasury, received diplomats, and coordinated a massive military defense against the rising Tokugawa shogunate. Lasting disruption requires the destruction of the institutional traditions that the old guard relies on for its legitimacy. Ogade Khan faced a different logistical problem.
how to rule a continent from the back of a horse. The Mongol Empire had become too large to govern with mobility alone. He built Karakoram, a permanent capital in the middle of the steppe. Here, he utilized foreign architects and engineers to create a hub for trade and taxation, turning nomadic victory into a functioning administration. He connected the empire with a horse-powered intelligence network. Messages traveled across the continent faster than a European king could cross his own province, giving Ogedei a constant stream of data from his farthest borders. Elizabeth I built her own system of dependency. By theatrically delaying major decisions and running a sophisticated spy network, she ensured that every member of her court remained focused on her signature alone. For these leaders, taking control was a two-step process. First, they broke the existing world, and then they locked their rivals into a new, inescapable architecture. The results were undeniable. Elizabeth launched a cultural golden age, while Nobunaga's reforms ended a century of civil war and created the framework for a unified Japan. Ogedei stabilized the largest contiguous land empire in history by prioritizing merit and logistics over the rigid tribal loyalties that had fractured previous nomadic confederations. Even after her defeat at Osaka, Lady Yodo's resistance was so impactful that the Tokugawa shogunate spent 2 centuries attempting to rewrite her as a villain, unable to simply delete her presence from the national story. History is full of monarchs who governed within the lines and were forgotten. These 4 were anomalies who forced the world to react to them. They show that power isn't just something to be received from the past. It is a narrative built entirely by those who have the audacity to tear up the existing playbook. History is usually pitched to us as a carefully engineered timeline. We tend to picture regal kings and clean castles executing grand master plans. But the reality of daily survival in the ancient and medieval worlds was much louder, a lot more terrifying, and completely caked in mud. The foundations of our modern world were rarely built on purpose. Instead, the systems we rely on today were the accidental byproducts of ordinary people reacting to immediate, brutal circumstances. This process shaped the 4 cornerstones of the world we know: global trade, political theater, human philosophy, and our enduring family ideals. To understand the actual architecture of civilization, we have to look past the myths of grand design and see the unintended consequences of human ambition, faith, and survival. In 1095, the average European knight was broke, bored, and mostly using his sword to bully local millers for extra flour. For these men, and the starving peasants behind them, the promise of holy salvation and physical loot was a way to escape the crushing monotony of village life. When this mob eventually reached cities like Constantinople, they encountered a level of sophistication they couldn't even name. They were used to leaky thatched roofs and mud huts. Suddenly, they were staring at soaring domes, clean running water, and stone walls taller than anything in their entire region. This exposure ruined their appetite for a diet of boiled turnips and watery porridge. Crusaders discovered cinnamon, pepper, and sugar, creating an insatiable European demand that forced the opening of permanent trade routes between East and West. They also stumbled over foreign technology. These warriors brought back smooth, lightweight paper and the concept of Arabic numerals, including the 0, which allowed European kings to manage taxes and contracts with an efficiency that calfskin parchment never allowed. By the Fourth Crusade, the mission shifted entirely into a massive looting venture. Maritime powers like Venice used their ships to haul back thousands of stolen artifacts and sacks of silver, using that plunder as a sudden injection of capital to build their commercial empires. A chaotic military expedition meant for conquest became an unplanned conduit for trade and technology, accelerating Europe's transition into a more connected, urbanized society. In early medieval Europe, military training was a bloody, unregulated mess. The first jousts were indistinguishable from brawls, chaotic melees where groups of knights slammed into each other at full gallop, often leaving men and horses trampled in the mud. To prevent their expensive mercenaries from dying in practice, organizers eventually introduced a long wooden barrier called a tilt. This forced knights into separate parallel lanes, ensuring they could strike one another's armor without the horses colliding head-on. Once the violence was contained, monarchs turned the sport into a political stage. They introduced heraldry and strict pageantry, using the controlled spectacle to display their wealth and reinforce bonds of loyalty through a highly sanitized version of combat. The attempt to keep knights from killing each other during training inadvertently created the template for the noble chivalric warrior, a legend that would come to define the European aristocracy for centuries. In a sanctuary carved into the hillside of Mount Parnassus, the most powerful political voice in the ancient world belonged to an older woman chosen from the surrounding villages. This was the Pythia, a human mouthpiece whose words could determine the start of a war or the founding of a city. Powerful leaders arrived seeking binary yes or no answers about their futures. Instead, they received ambiguous riddles delivered in a trance. In the private lives of medieval women, the most dangerous place was the birthing chamber. It was frequently described as a woman's battlefield, where complications were met with little more than herbal remedies and prayer, resulting in staggering mortality rates for both mother and child. The pressure was relentless. Peasant mothers needed surviving children for field labor, while noble women faced a brutal political duty to bear heirs, securing alliances and preserving dynasties with their own bodies. Society managed this constant cycle of grief by elevating the suffering mother to a sanctified status. The Church mirrored their daily struggles in the figure of the Virgin Mary, framing maternal endurance as a holy vocation and a central service to God. The gritty endurance required to survive medieval reproduction provided the cultural pattern of maternal sacrifice that persists in modern society. Looking back, there is a massive gap between intent and legacy. Crusaders didn't march to spark a renaissance. Knights didn't design a romantic literature. The Pythia wasn't trying to build philosophy, and mothers weren't asking to become cultural symbols. Our world is not the result of a grand master plan. It is the byproduct of ordinary people trying to survive the next year, protect their honor, or save their souls in the face of brutal odds. Human history functions as a massive, resilient survival story, built by millions of people who had no idea they were actually designing the future. We tend to view modern civilization as the result of meticulous, top-down planning. We operate within synchronized time zones, navigate neatly zoned city grids, and rely on standardized credentials to prove who we are. But this order rarely started on a drafting table. Most of our foundational institutions began as frantic, improvisational fixes to historical chaos. Civilization is a vast collection of emergency patches and calculated rebellions that humanity simply kept using long after the crisis passed. When a society begins to unravel, authorities reach for whatever works in the moment, and once that temporary fix succeeds, it hardens into permanent law. The medieval city was a densely packed trap of narrow alleys, timber, and open flames. In these environments, disease and fire were constant existential threats that forced a total rethink of how humans live together. Quarantine began as a brutal administrative delay. Port officials, facing ships full of coughing crews, forced vessels to sit offshore for 40 days, long enough for the disease to either burn itself out or reveal its victims before trade could resume. Standardized time followed a similar logic of necessity. Coordinating a fire brigade or enforcing a curfew was impossible when noon was just a personal opinion based on the sun. Cities mandated rigid mechanical schedules, using tower bells to ensure everyone showed up at the exact same moment. This map illustrates the roots of urban planning. After repeated fires, officials mandated stone construction and regulated building spacing. They realized narrow streets acted as wind tunnels, allowing flames to jump roofs. Widening roads wasn't aesthetic. It was a survival mechanism to create fire breaks. Fire codes, public health policies, and the clocks on our phones did not emerge to improve our quality of life. As civilizations scaled up, the fear of social ambiguity became its own kind of emergency.
In Rome, clothing served as a legal instrument of social sorting. Sumptuary laws turned the toga into wearable citizenship, ensuring that a person's rank and rights were visible to every passerby at a glance. Color became a protected resource of the state. Tyrian purple dye was so labor-intensive to produce that wearing it without permission was viewed as an imperial rivalry, a crime often punished as treason. This hierarchy extended down to the feet. Specific boots and strapped sandals instantly announced military rank or elite status at ground level, allowing the state to categorize its citizens without a word being spoken. Societies without massive bureaucracies relied on even more permanent methods. Tattoos served as a living archive, etched directly into the flesh. These marks functioned as an unforgeable resume or a permanent ledger of tribal obligation. Once inked, an individual carried their lineage, achievements, or their crimes in a way they could never remove or escape. These fashion laws and bodily markings were the earliest forms of state surveillance. They ensured that in any moment of chaos, a person's identity and status remained visible and controllable. At the highest levels of power, a crisis can be triggered by a single person's calculated refusal to play by the rules. Anne Boleyn refused the traditional, disposable role of a royal mistress. By demanding a legitimate marriage from Henry VIII, she created a bottleneck that the existing legal system was never designed to handle. Desperate to secure a male heir and circumvent the Pope's refusal to grant an annulment, Henry enacted a radical fix. He severed England's connection to Rome and declared the crown the supreme authority over a new English church. This wasn't a slow reform, it was a massive transfer of power. By dissolving the monasteries and absorbing their wealth, Henry centralized spiritual and legal authority, creating a more powerful state than his ancestors could have imagined. Once that state machinery was empowered, it was turned against Anne herself. When she became a liability to the succession, the crown used its newly centralized courts to legally assassinate her on fabricated charges. While Anne was erased, the structural break with Rome remained. The institutions of the modern English state were forged through the pressure of a single, desperate interpersonal conflict. Our physical infrastructure, our social hierarchies, and our governmental institutions all share a common origin. They are the results of civilizations snapping into new shapes during moments of extreme pressure. Stability rarely invites innovation. Usually, the fear of imminent collapse forces us to build the rules we live by today. This process is rarely predictable. The ultimate beneficiary of Anne's chaotic crisis was her daughter, Elizabeth, who inherited the centralized power her mother helped create and used it to rule England with more control than any monarch before her. Every bureaucratic form and zoning law carries the DNA of a past disaster. They are the permanent record of moments when civilization faced collapse and survived by improvising new rules that we simply never found a reason to uninstall.
We often assume scientific progress is a one-way street toward human flourishing, but history suggests a darker reality. What happens when a society encounters profound biological secrets centuries before it develops safety, anesthetics, or basic medical ethics? Dangerous knowledge doesn't stay confined. It moves outward in spheres of control. It begins intimately, mapping the physical mechanics of the individual human body before radiating out to infect entire communities and eventually cementing the absolute power of the state. In medieval Europe, early scholars began mapping the human form, identifying organs and tracing fluids with growing precision. But knowing where an organ sits does not mean knowing how to heal it. Instead of improving medicine, this raw anatomical data simply bred aggressive confidence. Armed with knives and zero anesthesia, physicians felt entitled to cut, poke, and drain their patients in ways that were experimental and often lethal. Legal authorities and executioners quickly found a more efficient application for this data. They realized that human pain was not random. It could be measured, extended, and applied in stages. By studying the body's physical limits, torturers became trained professionals. They learned exactly how to stretch a limb or crush a joint to keep a person conscious and suffering for as long as possible. Exposing the internal mechanics of the human machine offered no relief for the sick. It gave the state a biological blueprint to optimize agony, turning punishment into a calibrated science of suffering. This prioritization of utility over safety extended into the materials people touched every day. When medieval craftsmen first refined heavy metals like mercury and lead, they were captivated. These substances behaved in ways that seemed almost supernatural, flowing like water or proving stubbornly resistant to the elements. Lead became a staple of daily life. Plumbers used it for water pipes. Cooks used it to sweeten wine. It appeared in cosmetics to whiten faces, and in sheets to line the roofs of cathedral cities. It was everywhere, doing everything all at once. Soon, people started feeling the consequences. Memories faded, moods shifted, and hands developed uncontrollable tremors. But rather than investigate their plumbing or their pottery, medieval doctors and authorities blamed these strange, chronic illnesses on bad air, shifting planets, or moral failure. Because the society valued the utility of these materials more than the safety of its citizens, it built the foundations of its daily life on substances that poisoned generation after generation. Eventually, the radius of danger expanded to the neighbor. Humanity observed a deeply inconvenient pattern. When one person fell ill, those nearby often followed. The realization that disease moved actively between bodies forced entire cities to reevaluate the risks of human interaction. During the Black Death, cities like Florence became traps. The dense architecture stacked along the river made isolation impossible. In a space this tight, the knowledge of contagion caused social trust to evaporate. Markets emptied and streets grew silent as families barricaded themselves behind locked doors. Inside these homes, the domestic reality was one of constant vigilance. Women spent their nights listening for a child's cough, knowing that every single breath shared was a gamble. Quarantine wasn't a medical solution, it was a desperate reflex. People were sealed away and left to the mercy of chance. Without a cure, the fear of contagion was weaponized. Communities turned their anxiety outward, actively hunting down travelers, outsiders, and minorities, and blaming them for the spread of the plague. Understanding the mechanics of contagion didn't create a medical revolution. Instead, it engineered a society ruled by deep suspicion, where survival meant treating your own neighbors as lethal threats. Authorities learned that you didn't need to break a citizen's bones to control them. Psychological pain, specifically public humiliation and the threat of the unknown, was far more efficient for managing large crowds than physical violence ever could be. Public punishment became a form of civic entertainment. Stocks were staged in market squares so the condemned could be mocked. Permanent branding turned the human body into a walking warning sign, ensuring that a person's shame would never fade. Authorities also discovered that ideas themselves are dangerous. They developed systemic censorship and began actively purging entire libraries to ensure that certain revolutionary thoughts remained completely unread. If you punish a few writers publicly, the rest of the population quickly learns to self-police their own words. These calculated insights into human behavior were ultimately used to build completely compliant communities, bound permanently by terror and self-censorship. This brings us to the largest sphere of control, the state. Ancient rulers realized that if they could control a population's beliefs, they could make their power appear eternal. This was the logic of sacred incest. It was a calculated, rigid political ideology designed to separate the ruling class from the rest of humanity. By marrying within their own families, rulers claimed their blood was unique, infused with a literal divine essence. From Egypt to the islands of Hawaii, rulers used biological closeness to concentrate spiritual power, often called mana. A child born of these unions possessed such sacred authority that commoners were forbidden to even stand upright in their presence. It was a method of enforcing absolute physical hierarchy. Rulers turned their own biology into a political boundary, convincing their populations that they were governed not by men, but by gods. Ancient records describe the lost Egyptian labyrinth as a terrifyingly complex machine of pure administration. Every repeating corridor and controlled access point enforced the bureaucracy, funneling officials through a system where movement was a privilege. Despite its massive scale, the labyrinth vanished. As a tool of systemic control, it only mattered as long as the regime it served stayed in power. Once that system collapsed, the building was dismantled and quarried for parts. From medieval anatomy to Egyptian administration, the pattern is the same. Knowledge amplifies the values that already exist. In fearful or rigid societies, discovery is used to punish and control. History's greatest tragedy isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of restraint. We are left with the enduring question of whether the ability to do something means we actually should. For most of human history, the world was actively trying to kill you. Whether it was the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic or the crushing weight of a sudden ocean storm, the environment was a lethal threat. It is tempting to look back and assume the explorers and traders who survived these extremes were simply built differently, that they were immune to the cold or impervious to pain. They weren't. They froze, they starved, and they broke, exactly like we do. They survived because they mastered a very specific workaround. When faced with a hostile environment, early humans engineered havens, fragile, isolated pockets of warmth, safety, and humanity. The mapping of the globe and the creation of international trade networks didn't occur because humans outmuscled nature. It happened because we figured out how to carry these tiny, engineered sanctuaries with us into the void. Take the Vikings. Sailing the North Sea meant enduring a highly specific kind of freezing hell. There were no cabins. You stood on open wooden planks while the wind stabbed your face, and wool cloaks absorbed freezing seawater like a sponge. Looking at the exposed wooden clinker construction of this ship's hull, you can see a fatal flaw. There is no below-deck shelter. Lighting a traditional survival fire on a tar-sealed deck meant you were guaranteed to burn your ship down in the middle of the ocean. Instead, crews relied on the sleeping fire. This was a small metal or clay box filled with slow-burning coals, buried in ash. It didn't flame, and it couldn't physically warm a crew of 20 men. Its real purpose was psychological, a glowing reminder that warmth still existed in the world. To fight off actual frostbite, they relied on desperate physical workarounds. They stuffed their thin leather boots with dried grass or moss to create organic insulation. And at night, they crammed together under damp cloaks to harvest each other's body heat. By combining a glowing ember, grass insulation, and shared body heat, they engineered a microhaven. That collective survival strategy kept their blood moving just enough to reach land alive. Sometimes, the environment trying to crush you isn't nature, but society. Look at the imposing posture of King Henry VIII in this portrait. It perfectly captures the rigid, overwhelming authority of Tudor England, where the Church enforced an absolute doctrine of clerical celibacy. This institutional doctrine conflicted with baseline human nature and the psychological need for connection in an intensely lonely parish life. So the clergy adapted. They built hidden havens of intimacy to bypass the rules. Priests frequently employed women under the official title of housekeeper. In practice, these women acted as unofficial wives, sharing meals, maintaining the household, and raising children. You can see the isolating architecture and high stone barriers of these abbey ruins, but even here, rebellions thrived. Nuns smuggled letters across courtyards, maintained forbidden romances, and carved tiny hearts into wooden choir stalls. When an institution attempts to outlaw a basic human need, people will engineer hidden sanctuaries within those cold stone walls just to preserve their own sanity. If we move to the Silk Road, the threat shifts back to geography. The deserts stretching between China and the Mediterranean were brutal landscapes, where sandstorms, dehydration, and bandits constantly threatened to sever early global trade. Their solution was the caravanserai, massive inns spaced a day's journey apart. Notice how heavy stone walls frame this wide courtyard, creating a fortress against the desert. Inside these arched alcoves, Chinese silk masters and Persian monks safely exchanged goods, languages, and ideas. This chain of stone havens provided the essential physical infrastructure that kept merchants alive, allowing early globalization to survive the wilderness. In the 14th century, a Moroccan scholar named Ibn Battuta pushed the limits of these havens. Over 30 years, he completed a 75,000-mile journey across medieval deserts and oceans. He faced staggering mortal threats. He survived ambushes in the Sahara, violent monsoons that sank his ships off the coast of India, and the highly unpredictable politics of foreign courts. He survived because he tapped into a borderless sanctuary. A single continuous line connected his route. He utilized a vast continent-spanning network of Islamic hospitality. Looking at the massive scale of this crowd around the Kaaba, you can see the unifying power of that shared faith. Offering a simple religious greeting guaranteed Ibn Battuta shelter and trust from local scholars and merchants, turning a deadly globe into a connected neighborhood. That mutual trust formed a powerful cultural haven, proving that a shared belief system could provide the exact same safety as a stone fortress, even across thousands of miles of otherwise hostile territory. A smoldering ember in a Viking clay box, a forbidden romance behind an abbey wall, a fortified courtyard in the desert, and a shared greeting in a foreign port. These are all identical mechanisms of human survival. Modern globalization traces its lineage back to these ancient rebellions against environmental and societal extremes. By engineering safety where none existed, these travelers proved that human connection could survive the most hostile conditions on Earth. Our ability to endure comes directly from a hardwired drive to connect, to build, and to find companions in the dark. When the world pushes back with everything it has, we don't just endure the storm. We stubbornly build tiny fires right inside of it, and we find ways to survive the impossible.